Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. Lots going on, but this week we're going to be going back to the bread and butter, talking about why it's going to be difficult for central banks to return inflation to the target rates. Brunello, it sort of seems to me that kind of every economic age has one number that they fixate on. Maybe in the 80s, it was something like the M2 money supply. 10 years ago, it was the payroll forms. I think the number of this era is definitely inflation. It's what everyone cares about. And it's certainly what all the central banks are focusing all their time and energy on to respond to sort of market concerns to get it back after the sort of inflation environment we've seen over the last couple of months to years. I think we want to attack some of the main central banks today. Should we start off with the U.S. Federal Reserve? How are its deliberations looking? How likely will it be in being successful to return these to go back to these inflation targets?
Yeah, you're right. So inflation is clearly front and center of every policymaker, in particular central banks, of course. Um, uh, Also, you said in past, people were looking at supply or non-farm payrolls. In fact, they were kind of leading indicators, if you want, of future inflation, money supply, because during the monetarist era, people thought that inflation was a pure monetary phenomenon. And then when the Indonesians came back to before, they actually understood that, you have to control for domestically generated inflation by the labor market. And so people were obsessed with the non-farm payrolls. So, inflation has always been among us one way or the other. When it was 2% or sub 2%, it wasn't a big problem. If anything, central banks had the issue of bringing inflation back to target from below. Now we are back to the traditional problem of central bankers, which is bringing inflation to target from above. The Fed has started this process early on in March 2022, has risen rates several times back to back, up to 75 basis points per time, and then has reduced 15, then 25, and then they closed in June 2023. But it was clear from Powell's remarks at the press conference and subsequent conversations that was probably more a skip than a close, meaning that July is probably another month in which the Federal Reserve will increase rates again. And then the Fed has also indicated in the set notes that they want to raise rates at least twice more in H2, in the second part of this year. So assuming July, then the question is when is next? They could do back to back, so July and September, or they could skip another meeting, so skip June to July, skip September and do November, skip December, and the cycle. That could be one potential outcome. Then Powell said we haven't decided yet, and it's probably true. They want to see what inflation does. It's possible that they do June. Inflation is already on 3%, so it's not too far from the target. They could do July, wait for more numbers in September, and then it was the need for an additional hike in November. They can do it and finish the job there. Clearly, like all other central banks, the Fed will likely keep rates at the high level, at the peak level for a pretty long period of time.
Absolutely. And if we're looking sort of across the pond, at the European Central Bank, how do they match up to the Fed?
So they've actually started later and from a lower base. So the deposit rate was minus 50 basis points when they started. But they have been doing their homework, and so they've raised the repo rate to 3.5%. So in total, we're talking about 400 basis points of increase. This is less than the 500 of the Fed, 525, but there's more to go. So July is a done deal. Question is what happens afterwards. It's probable another hike in September, December, October, or December. Open question. Uh, we will see. It's difficult to see a terminal rate much higher than 4% when we think about the deposit rate. But you never know. If inflation remains sticky, you might be surprised on the upside.
Sure. And looking at the Bank of England, it seems to be mired in this complicated situation. Will it get out of it?
Yeah, I mean the BOE is in the most troublesome situation. Inflation is sticky. We are talking a headline at 8.7% headline. So the core inflation is 7.1%. So we are pretty far away from what the Fed and the ECB are looking at. So there's more ground to cover, although back rate is already 5%. So they might be needing to increase rates up to 6% in coming months. People say they may reach 6% by the end of the year. With the 4 meetings left, starting from August, bam, 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 25 basis points each. So 100 cumulative on cumulative basis and reach 6% by the end of the year. That would be pretty high. But again, if inflation doesn't come down, there's no other option at this stage. Having said that, this is not all demand-driven inflation. There's lots of supply-driven inflation there, some deriving from Brexit. So the Bank of England needs to be very careful how they place this.
Absolutely. I I mean these are some measures to, bring inflation down, but there's obviously these sort of almost systemic factors that keep pushing it up. I think the real question is, will the central banks manage to bring inflation down to the targets in a sustained basis for the kind of medium to long term? How do you sort of think about the success of that?
That's the biggest problem. So central banks will increase rates to their terminal rates, whatever it is, 5.5, 6%. We'll see. They will keep rates high at that level for much longer than market expect. The markets are expecting rates to be cut almost immediately after reaching the peak. That doesn't make much sense for the central bank to do unless some catastrophic event happens on the real economy. And that's number one. Number two, though, inflation is supposed to be, we have said several times that is going to be higher than in past for several reasons deriving from technological transition, deglobalization, balkanization of global supply chain, redistribution of income between capital and labor. So all these factors will keep inflation higher than in past. So what will central bank do? They will try to bring inflation down to target. It may actually happen for base effects because inflation last year was so much higher than this year. But on a sustained basis, on average, inflation is likely to remain much higher than 2% of the last decades. It's probably going to be 3.5%, 4% on average for the next decades. So the real question is it worth for central banks to tighten monetary policy so to bring inflation down to the old-fashioned 2% target? Is it the cost worth paying in terms of loss of output and increase in unemployment? We don't think that's the case. Central banks are independent, but however independent, there's still some level of political pressure. They want to keep this independence, so they cannot totally go against what other policymakers would do, because otherwise this independence will be taken away from them. So they live in the world. They don't live in some ivory tower, and they need to be considering the effects of their actions in more general terms. So I think we'll de facto decide to tolerate inflation higher than in the past. But the euro, they will not ask for a revision of the inflation targets. It's going to be too complicated, too costly in terms of reputation. So they will probably only de facto accept the higher inflation rates, explaining that for a variety of reasons they cannot go lower than say 3.5%, 4% on average. They need flexibility, they need time, people need to be patient. They will try not to de-anchor inflation expectations too much, but they will have to face these serious trade-offs in the future. So that's the situation they're in at the moment.
Right. And you know, with the amount of elections coming up in the coming years or in the coming months, we know that inflation has certainly become a key kind of political talking point, as well as it continues to affect the lives of ordinary people, especially in kind of swing areas of the countries that have elections. So it's not like governments are keen to push up inflation targets either, because that would effectively be them admitting to reneging on their promises. So I think, yeah, very much so we'll see, you know, an acceptance of the status quo and a promise to make it better in the short term. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.